You're listening to episode 133 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Ginger Campbell and Dana Nourie speak with us about the complex, interrelated processes we refer to as consciousness. What is self? Is it your body? So if you lose your left pinky finger, is that really losing a part of you? Is it your memories? Or some other aspect of mind, like consciousness? And for that matter, what is consciousness? There are many different ideas about these questions from a variety of disciplines. Scientific thought may not say the same thing as philosophy, which in turn has a wide variety of concepts that may not merge so well with an equally complex set of religious views. However we answer the question of what is consciousness, it is a rich area of thought, discussion, debate, and exploration. Dr. Ginger Campbell is an experienced emergency physician with a long-standing interest in mind-body medicine, the brain, and consciousness. She is also interested in a wide variety of other topics, including the history of science and ideas. She began podcasting in 2006 and has discovered that it is a great way to share ideas with people from around the world. Her Brain Science podcast explores how recent scientific discoveries are unraveling age-old mysteries, such as intelligence, emotions, personality, and memory. Dana Nourie does not label herself a Buddhist, though she does practice Buddhist teachings and associates with secular Buddhists. She has been a guest on the Secular Buddhist podcast many times and has been the primary blogger on the Secular Buddhist Association website. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice downy white tea. And our guests today are Dr. Ginger Campbell.
Hi, Ted.
And Dana Nourie.
Hi, Ted.
So today we're going to do things a little bit different. We don't do this very often, but some listener input has suggested that we have a few more round tables. So I've decided to schedule a few more of those and bring back a couple of guests that we've had on the podcast before. Ginger Campbell, as mentioned to people who have listened, is the person who runs the Brain Science podcast. And Dana Nourie is, of course, the technical director for the Secular Buddhist Association. And today we're going to be talking about consciousness. So one of the things that we want to do first is make sure we're talking about the same thing. So we want to define by what we mean by consciousness and what it's for. So, Ginger, why don't you get us started with what you see as some important characteristics of a definition of consciousness?
Well, I'd like to refer back to one of your earlier episodes when you interviewed Dan Siegel, and he was talking about the definition of mind and how there's not a clear-cut definition for mind among scientists. And I think the same thing can be said for consciousness. So I think we should start with a good jumping-off point, I think, is Dan's definition of mind, which is a process that's going on that involves the brain, the body, and the world around us. And I'm paraphrasing his definition, but thinking of mind as a process helps us to also think of consciousness as a process. And this is tricky because consciousness in common usage is almost a synonym with awareness. But usually when you're talking about something like philosophy of mind, which is usually what it's called in philosophy when they're trying to figure out consciousness, it's, consciousness means the particular thing that people have that we assume most animals don't have, although there's some question about whether or not I actually believe most animals have consciousness, but not everyone shares that.
We're all dog people on this call, so we would agree with you.
Yeah.
And I just don't see how animals could function without it. But anyway, go ahead.
But let's just say that the best we can do is a working definition. A working definition of consciousness would be that you have both an awareness of yourself and the world around you. And that's kind of the working definition I'm going to be going from. And there's a dog now.
There's a dog now. Yeah. And I think for purposes of our discussion around people consciousness and how we apply to this in our secular Buddhist practice, for example, I think that's a very good definition. And one thing I liked that you said several times, and that is it's a process, that there is not a monolithic thing that we can grab and take out of a brain and say, this bit here, this is consciousness.
Yeah, and then there's the whole issue of, when you're asleep, are you unconscious? If you're dreaming, is that a form of consciousness? Are altered states of consciousness, certainly this is relevant to meditators, are those continuous with what we usually mean by the word consciousness? I don't know exactly what the answer to that is, but I remember when I was talking to Thomas Metzinger, who wrote an excellent book called The Ego
Tunnel. Yep.
Yeah. He was talking about the importance of, if we're going to understand consciousness, we need to take into account those strange experiences that people have. That if we ignore those things, then we aren't really explaining the phenomenon as it really exists.
Right. We're not looking at the full data set. And I think this is a very good segue, Dana, to one of your questions on scientific consensus. What is that around consciousness? Could you say a little bit more about what you wanted to ask about that?
Yeah, there seems to be there's a lot of confusion between awareness and consciousness, and then there's also this other idea that there are levels of consciousness, and that's what we see in our personal experience, I think. Like Ginger brought up the fact that we sleep. We do seem to experience varying levels of consciousness, or is that varying levels of awareness? And that's what I get a little confused about. I almost wonder if the word consciousness doesn't confuse things. Is it really different than that which we are aware of?
Yeah, that's why I really rather focus on the question of what makes up our mind, because if you look at the mind, then you can allow for different levels of consciousness as a part of what the mind does. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of, I've kind of moved away from using the word consciousness, to be honest with you, although I did devote an early episode to that. Now I have a big interest in philosophy of mind. I'm actually exploring an entirely new avenue of that right now, which I will tell you about in the future, relating to the use of phenomenology. And this is because, like I said, in philosophy, which philosophy of mind intersects with neuroscience now, they like the word mind, which I think there's a good reason for that, because even though we, again, can't agree on the definition, and I think with when we're talking about meditation, people are concerned with their mind also. So I think actually maybe going toward using the word mind might be a way of partially dealing with this problem, because the word conscious has so many colloquial uses.
Yeah.
Of course, So does mind, but
Right.
but
Yeah, and I see mind for myself as the subjective experience of what my brain does. So it's only those things I'm aware of. And that helps me clarify for myself what it is I can't observe it unless I'm aware of it, and that has to happen in the context of mind, which seems to me goes through the brain.
yeah, but so much of what the brain does is outside of
Right.
awareness that I think if you limit your mind to just what you're aware of, you're ignoring most of what your brain's doing.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so do you consider things that we are not aware of to be also within the context of mind?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that ties into a bit this concept of perception, because there are things that may be that we are not perceiving that nonetheless are part of that overall process. I'm a
Yeah.
process guy, so of course I like using that word. And I know, Ginger, this is also a big topic in your podcast, as Dana had pointed out to me earlier. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that whole um, that shared world out there that our perception, however, is built within a mind. Color, sound, all of that. And maybe talk about how that's not necessarily the accurate reflection of what the world is, or perception of it.
Yeah, well, actually, perception is a good example of what I was just talking about, which is the fact that a lot of what goes on we never have any conscious awareness of. We know that our perception of the world is processed so much. I mean, even in vision, for example, is so much processing goes on before any of it reaches our awareness. And vision is the most well studied because it's the easiest, in some ways, it's the easiest to study. They can know objectively what is being presented to a person or an animal's retina. They know exactly what the starting signal is, and they know the circuits pretty well, so they can really kind of follow where the process happens. But I think it's um, becoming more evident that almost everything our brain does follows a similar sort of processing method where very little of what's actually going on makes it to our consciousness. Otherwise, we would not be able to deal with what was that William James said, the buzzing confusion. I think there's another part of that quote, but anyway, it would be too much if
Mm-hmm.
we and that's I think one of the theories of autism actually is that people that have autism actually get too much information that they can't use reaching their consciousness. Not the social information that they need, but other information that they don't need, which kind of overwhelms them.
Now, a couple of things that ties into, and it's a bit challenging for us to cover so much in such a short time, so I think we'll just take a look at them one at a time, is this concept of embodiment. And I know this ties to our concepts of self and our personal space. So, Ginger, why don't we chat for a little bit about that whole role of embodiment and the problem of the brain and the bat? Let's take it from that example.
Okay, well, I think we might need a little bit of historical perspective here. In the cognitive, what's I think it's called the cognitive revolution or cognitive science, traditionally there was an approach, and this is going back to the 50s and 60s, that saw the mind as being something computational, something like a computer. And they couldn't figure out things like, they would try to create robots to do things that we do easily, like walk around, and it turned out to be really hard. And so somebody came up with the idea that maybe part of the problem was that they weren't taking embodiment into consideration. And so a whole realm in the robotics field came out with in basically embodied robots where they would design some of what the robot needed to do into the body of the robot instead of trying to calculate it. And this sort of led to the realization that you can't just think of the brain as something separate. Actually, the way I look at at it is, your brain, if it didn't have a body, it doesn't have any inputs and it doesn't have any outputs. That's why I
Right.
think Brain in the Vat. I think of this Lily Tomlin movie I saw many years ago where her character is brain in a vat, and I think about how silly that was, but it was a really funny movie. But the way we interact is just so totally dependent on our body, and this is turned out to be a real fruitful approach in both robotics and in trying to understand how the mind works, and it's kind of the hot area right now. But the key idea is that the body is so much of what you can't really separate mind and body. In fact, I'm trying to figure out how to describe what I'm interested in, because I used to tell people I had an interest in mind-body medicine, and I decided that's really kind of a misrepresentation of what's really going on now, and I don't know what a new phrase.
Because it assumes a duality. Yeah.
Ginger, if
Yeah.
I can jump in here, this, when I first got into Buddhism, it was really confusing to me why Buddha focused on the body so much. Body meditation is so crucial in our practice. And it's just because of that. We take in all the information in our environment from other people through our senses. And once we do that, then it triggers our reaction. It might be emotional, it might be mental, but it all works together. And so we're not an isolated system. We're very much interdependent on our environment and the people that we interact with. And this is kind of the foundation of ethics as well. It all works together in this. And so it's really interesting, the way that the embodiment and consciousness and so forth, and that now they're finally recognizing that the brain is a part of an entire nervous system, and we get all our information through our senses and process them in all kinds of ways. And part of our practice is watching these processes as they arise. Now, we can't see directly what the brain or the nerves are doing, but we do have the experience, if we're mindful, of seeing how these processes arrive in coordination with everything else.
Yeah, and given that, it's really surprising how people outside of Buddhism think that it's about, just being in your head. I mean, it has a total...
Well, that's where most people spend their time. It really is a challenge to learn mindfulness and take a step back and see what's happening. I remember when I first got into it, I was just wildly fascinated that our emotions are actually a separate process but work in conjunction with thoughts. The thought might arise first and trigger the emotion, or the emotion might arise first and trigger the thought, and then they feed each other. And if you can get off the loop of thoughts, for instance, the emotions will settle down. They'll just dissipate, and vice versa. And it's just really fascinating once you see that in action.
Yeah, it's part of that ongoing process. But Ginger, tell us about being a bat. You don't get that question very often in interviews, I know, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you're referring to the famous essay, I think, was it Thomas Nagel? And he was really talking about the problem of what is it like to experience something. So what would it be like to be a bat? And actually, more recently, there was a woman who, I think it was a woman, I read a book last year about the inner lives of dogs. Oh, we got to figure out what the right name of this book is for your show notes. But she was talking about the Umwelt. Is it the Umwelt? Anyway, the world of every animal, every species has its own Umwelt, which is it's the world as perceived by that type of animal. So, for example, dogs, it turns out their vision, although they don't have color, they can actually see slightly faster than we can, which probably explains how they catch balls that we couldn't possibly catch, which is kind of weird to think about. And of course, we all know they can smell lots of stuff we can't smell. So their world is totally different from ours. So if we were a bat, of course, they don't see at all. They're operating by radar. That's really hard for a human to imagine.
Right, and it is Umwelt is what you're thinking of.
Yeah, Umwelt. Yeah.
Yeah,
And and we have that same kind of thing as we consider, say, dolphins and the way they perceive things, or different kinds of creatures that just use different sensing apparatus or different interfaces with their environment. As we talk about mind, and that is not just the gray matter, not just the brain, but this entire complex and the entire process of our involvement with our environment that we find ourselves in, it becomes much more interesting than even individual brains.
Yeah, and that harkens back to perception as well. The bat goes on radar, and Richard Dawkins was saying that they probably, the bat brain probably translates that radar into some kind of visual image in their brain, in the same way that we get light into the eye, and then our brain translates that into color. So all of our experience is simply a brain translation of what's coming in through the senses. Is that fair to say, Ginger?
Well, I think that it's fair to say that the bat at least gets some kind of spatial image of the world. I don't know whether visual would be the right word, but, who can say?
Right. Some kind of mapping.
Yeah, mapping. But it brings us back to that question of who's conscious. And as I was saying before we started today, I was thinking about talking to you today about an interview I did several years ago with Seth Grant in the UK, who is like the world's leading researcher on the synapse, which is the connection between the neurons. And he's been studying the evolution of the synapse. And one of the things he's discovered is that the neurotransmitters, the chemicals of the brain, and the receptors that the neurotransmitters interact with, a lot of these are extremely old. They go back like dopamine. Almost everyone's heard of dopamine. Mm-hmm. It goes back to single-cell organisms like yeast. And when you think about the fact that a single-cell organism like a bacteria can move away toward good stuff like food and away from noxious stuff, that's making a decision. If you wanted to define consciousness as the ability to make choices, you could argue that a single-celled organism is conscious. And also there's that whole issue of, well, what's consciousness for? And the traditional answer is that once creatures began moving around, we needed to be able to be making decisions and adapt, and then consciousness made it possible to be more adapt quickly into surprising things. But if you look back to that, I'm not saying that single-celled organisms are conscious, but what I am saying is that actually there's probably a continuum from that very earliest time up to human, and so probably it's going to be. I'm pretty comfortable in thinking that plants aren't conscious, although I realize there are some people who think they are. But
that's what I was just going to say. This is one of my pet peeves. I love plants dearly. I'm really interested in them from a botany level, and I'm reading this really great book on what trees know. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about decision making, whether it is purely a chemical reaction decision or whether it is a mind type of decision. And so trees, have this amazing ability to detect when nearby trees are being infested by beetles that kill them, and they will set off a chemical reaction. But all of this is being done through chemistry. There isn't any reason yet to think that trees have a decision-making ability such as mind like people do.
Unless it's Treebeard and it starts warning you about being hasty, in which case, that tree's conscious, be careful.
Yeah, but there does seem to be a difference between chemical reaction or decision-making, but then again, how is the brain making decisions? It's also making them through chemical reactions.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that's a very good point, is that we draw that line because really our decisions are chemical in nature as well, so are we
Right, right.
not
So
much
decision
different from
making
trees?
right now is a very hot topic in lots of ways, and I think for good reasons. It's going to be interesting to see where we go with it.
Well, that's a good question on this whole self-awareness. And Ginger, we talk about this idea of the single-celled organism having a tropism to uh, darkness away from light because light is damaging, and it's just a movement. It's an interaction with its environment. And this idea of a more developed, more highly developed sense of self-awareness and how that may have evolved and why we may need that for survival. Could you tell us a little bit about what you found out in that from your podcast about the evolution of a sense of self-awareness?
Well, it's not something I've studied specifically, but my impression from what I've read is that the general consensus is it has to do with becoming complex social creatures. That is, having a sense of self relates to having a sense of others and being able to get along with others. Of course, even that, you get into that whole thing of, well, what about ants and bees? So there's you never can come up with there's nothing that has a simple answer. But when it comes to what we know is different in terms of humans, say, versus uh, chimpanzees, for example, when they study small children and chimpanzees, they sort of chimpanzees sort of plateau at a certain point that seems to be related to social behavior, at least. And you could argue that has to do with the way the experiments are designed. But at the very least, that's where our state of knowledge is right now. That it seems to be. I mean, you can't. Obviously, humans, the way that we survived, not being the strongest, biggest teeth and stuff, was because we lived in groups and took care of each other. So being able to be social seems to be a very big part of our ability to survive. And of course, the current theory of mind idea is that about the mirror test.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right,
Yep.
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
and there's
However, some of the audience
Right.
might not be.
Okay, well, the idea behind the mirror test is that the way you can tell whether a animal has a sense of self is whether or not it can recognize itself in the mirror. And the way this is normally carried out is that they'll take the animal or this child and they'll put some paint or something on its face or some part of its body it can get to, depending on the animal, and see what it does when it looks in the mirror. If you did this to a dog, dogs do not recognize themselves in the mirror. I'm sure you've tested this on your own dogs.
Maybe.
They do seem to be able to see what's going on in the mirror and recognize, my dogs look, the way my house is laid up, they'll look in the mirror to tell who's upstairs and downstairs all the time. They understand mirrors to that extent.
Okay.
But
and I've wondered in those tests how much the outcome has to do with how familiar the animal is with reflections and whether or not they ever see themselves.
Yeah, well, that gets back to the whole problem of designing experiments involving other species. We're always limited by the fact that our imagination is sort of centered on how we see the world.
Right. Our own sense of self, yes, which we like to project too.
So let's chat for a little bit then about this idea of self. And we have a couple of different kinds of selves. And Dana, you had some questioning around those illusory selves and how there's a bit more of a hardwired, substantial self that we can fake out with things like the rubber hand experiment. Why don't you chat for a moment about that, Dana?
I'm coming across in neuroscience and psychology, it seems to be two types of self. There are neuroscientists who are suggesting that the brain actually creates an illusory self, actually two of them, one which is aware and the other which is the observer. And that seems to be a component, they suggest, of the human brain. And then there's these other selfing processes which are psychological, that as we're raised from babies, we create a sense of self by interacting with other people through school, social interactions, and then the greater cultural context of it as well. And so, Ginger, I was wondering, I heard a little bit of self in some of the podcasts, and I was just wondering what your take is on the creation of a self from the brain perspective. How much of that is actually physiologically known, and how much is it considered more psychologically built?
Okay, well, I would refer back again to Thomas Metzinger's interview because he's talked about this a lot, and he seems to feel that based on the experiments he's done with Olaf Blanc, which Olaf Blanc is the researcher who's figured out that you can stimulate people's a certain part of the temporal lobe and make people have out of body experiences.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's basically shown that those kinds of experiences have a physiological origin, and they've done other experiments where they've managed to make people have illusions of being outside their body. The rubber hand illusion is an illusion where people begin to have the sense that a rubber that when you stroke this rubber hand, if you've sent it in the right alignment to them, that their hand is being touched. This all seems to have something to do with also our body mapping, which is one of the things our brain does. And then there also seems to be some circuitry for ownership, so that it is possible when people have certain kinds of brain damage, they may feel that their hand doesn't belong to them anymore. At the same time, which is kind of the flip side of thinking the rubber hand does belong to you. All that's clearly physiological. Of course, I would argue that anything psychological is by definition also physiological, but that's, yeah. But then the whole our sort of social self that you were talking about, I'm getting ready to do an interview soon with Bruce Hood, who's a developmental psychologist, has a new book out called The Self Illusion.
He was just at TAM.
Yeah, and he that's kind of the theme of that book, is that he's basically arguing that a lot of our sense of self is socially created. And that gets back to what I was actually trying to allude to before when I was talking about the importance of the social milieu and getting, a self. So, yeah.
Yeah, and now see, from the Buddhist perspective, there is a misunderstanding by people that Buddha was saying there is no self. The teaching is actually not self. Buddha was big on pointing out the body is not self, this thought is not self, that thought is not self, this emotion is not self, for the reason that they are in constant change, constant turmoil. And we make the mistake of clinging to them as though that is a solid, unchanging self, and then that causes a lot of suffering and grief over when the changes happen in all of those processes.
Wasn't he also reacting to the Indian Hindu view of Atman, which was that there was this sort of, I am not really big on Hindu thought, but it seems to me like it's sort of like a super self that they wanted to merge with, and I could be wrong about that because it's been a long time since I read
That's
that.
an excellent way to put it.
You're exactly right.
And that's he was, and when he was saying not Atman or whatever I'm sorry, my Pali sucks.
As does most of us.
That he was basically saying that doesn't exist.
Right.
Right. Part of that background context is that you put it very well in that an idea is to merge with Brahma, with that overall super consciousness, as you're saying, is one way to word that, which may be making a few people listening to the podcast twitch. Sorry, we're trying to be general here, not super detailed. But part of that also is that the context that had grown up around that is that one's progress through multiple lifetimes was based upon very specific rituals, and these were actions one would take, for example, sacrifices and things like that. And what his real big social change was the idea that no, that's not what really makes things better for you as an individual. It's your actions. It's cause and effect, not in terms of the magic of ritual, but in terms of your actions having consequences, and that whole karma and cause and effect, and whether one looks at that as a from one life to next, or one sees that just as a metaphor for a current lifetime and moment by moment consciousness, so to speak. That really was a groundbreaking and very, very different paradigm-changing kind of idea that didn't exist at the time. So that those are inextricably coupled, is that idea of not only not a permanent monolithic self that goes poof from one body to the next, but that one's progress throughout lifetime and perhaps moment by moment is based on one's personal actions in a cause and effect way, not a magic sacrifice kind of way.
And I think this is where brain plasticity comes in too. We're not stuck being the way we are in this moment. It is going to change, and we can hopefully guide it in a direction of change that's not going to create more suffering for ourselves or for others. And this is part of the mindfulness, is watching how our minds work and how we create all these stories in our head that just create more suffering than what's actually happening in reality. And this is the part of the selfing process that we cling to, these stories, you know.
And that's a really good topic I think we can probably close with, is chatting a bit about that neuroplasticity, or as I think Dan Siegel has phrased it, self-directed neuroplasticity. Ginger, maybe you can tell us just a little bit about biologically, neurologically, what do we mean by neuroplasticity, and then some of the ideas around how meditation can help direct that neuroplasticity.
Well, the most important thing that I think neuroscience has discovered in the last couple of decades is the fact that the adult brain is very plastic. And what that means is not only is it false that I know I was taught that that you couldn't make new neurons, and that you are constantly, I think the myth is something like losing 20,000 neurons a day.
Yeah.
And it turns out we're not losing any, actually, and we're actually making new ones. And that's good news. But those new ones need stimulation in order to become part of active circuits in the brain. And so when you decide to do something like mindfulness meditation, then you are actually, helping those new neurons and even your old ones to, make new connections. And I think people like Richie Davidson have done, the great research that's showing that there are objective changes that can be shown in the brain with mindfulness practice, which just confirms what, of course, meditators have known for a long time. But for some reason, people like brain scans.
We like our hard evidence. We like our pictures.
Well, yeah, I like having evidence. I'm not one of these people who sits and has a wonderful, calm meditation. I have a very busy mind, and I don't find meditation enjoyable. But I have experientially found it to be very beneficial. But it's nice to also know that my brain is really benefiting, that I'm not just making up the benefits or perceiving it without it being a part of my reality.
Well, the reason I put it that way was because I remember when I interviewed Edward Taub several years ago. He is the founder of a method of stroke rehabilitation called constraint movement induced therapy, which basically has shown that people can recover from stroke a lot better than they ever thought, and that places other parts of the brain can take up actions that were formerly done by the damaged parts of the brain. And when I was interviewing him, he was talking about how he had the evidence in patients for years, and no one would pay any attention until they had the brain scans. And to me, that's, as a physician, I think that's ridiculous. I think that we put too much emphasis on brain scans.
I think they are paying a lot more attention now, or at least it seems to, from what I'm reading, in people's experience. You did a really good podcast. I can't recall what it was called now, on people's various metaphysical experiences, and that they are studying them through the brain now and finding out what the brain is doing. Now, that doesn't mean that it's an outside experience. It may be very much an in-the-head experience. But I do think we need to apply science to everything, which is why we encourage in secular Buddhism to have the scientists study us as well.
Yeah, it's good to have that external verification of the experiences we have, that there is something going on, and it's not to discount that someone is having an experience, but that we need to check into what's happening, because our perception, and as we've been talking about here, that may not be accurate. We need to verify what exactly is going on, and that's so that we're not misled into areas of investigation or of practice.
Or harm.
That may not be right. Or harm, yeah.
Because I've had concerns about people who can go into what's called the deeper jhanas. They obviously come out and they seem to be okay, but I wondered, what is really happening in the brain? Is this okay to go into that deep of a state of whatever they're doing? And I think we are getting some great studies out on mindfulness meditation. But that is a little bit different than some of these deeper states. And these people have experiences, but it would be nice to see what the scientific view of those experiences reveals.
So we see that consciousness is a process, that there's a great range of it, that there is, of course, also a great range and different ideas around self, and that we have the ability, and we are verifying this as science is showing us, to have positive impacts on our brains. And therefore, as that being a substrate of mind, not the only part, there's of course body and an entire environment which affects this. We have some choices in what we do moment by moment that can help positively shape what we do and how we respond in our environment. Ginger, is there anything else you wanted to add to today's conversation?
No, I sort of feel like we just kind of barely scratched the surface. This is really a hard subject to fit into a single podcast, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a crash course. We did a crash course.
Yeah, and Buddhism also covers, so many areas of the mind, and I have found it super helpful to my practice to have my coexisting interest in neuroscience, because like for instance, the whole Buddhist views of self was very confusing to me at first. The literature, some of it almost makes it sound like we don't even exist, and to hear the scientific viewpoint, it was, okay, this is what they actually mean. And then I could go back to my practice and look at it from that viewpoint, and I just found it really opened it up for me in a huge way.
So our guests today have been Ginger Campbell, and you can find out more about what Ginger is doing on her Brain Science podcast, and that website address is www.brainsciencepodcast.com. And Dana Nourie has joined us from the secularbuddhism.org, or the Secular Buddhist Association website. Ginger, thank you very much for being here. As always, a pleasure.
Thanks. It was great talking to you again.
And Dana, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here as well.
Oh, thank you. And it was so nice to be able to talk with Ginger. It's very exciting because I'm a big fan.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.